See founding mothers of Petoskey.
You
Yep.
can,
Okay. Yep.
oh, okay, good. Founding mothers of Petoskey.
That's what I see.
Okay, it worked. All right. Well, if somebody else joins, I will let them in, but it's the two of you, so welcome.
All right. This is pretty special.
It is, and thanks for signing up. So this is a program that was originally done in 1974, and it was presented by Mert Carter, who was the museum curator that year, and Mrs. Norman Bowman, um, and they presented it at the museum in November 1974. So they started by talking about the Home Benevolent Society, and uh, the Home Benevolent Society was founded in 1886 by Anna Kirkland to help those less fortunate in Petoskey, and it was primarily the mossbacks. And so I didn't have any pictures of mossbacks, and I chose some pictures from Little Mossback Amelia to illustrate the mossbacks. I've heard two descriptions of how they got their name. One was that they cut big pieces of moss to cover up the cracks in the walls and the ceilings of their homes. And the other was that they had to sleep out of doors so often that they grew moss on their backs, hence the name mossback. And really, I don't know which is the reason, and maybe there's a different reason altogether. So these people were people that were homesteading. They didn't have funds to feed their families or clothe their families. And so Anna Kirkland and some other ladies decided to start the Home Benevolent Society. And the story goes that a young girl came into town. So these homesteaders were all people who were living outside of town trying to start farms. And a young girl came to town and said her sister had passed away and she needed a shroud to bury her, and could somebody help her? And so Mrs. Kirkland and some of the other ladies decided that they needed to figure out a way to help these poor families. So that was how they got started. It was originally called the Dorcas Society, and there were many Dorcas societies that different churches started, but this group was not associated with any church. In fact, they had women from many different churches who were involved in this society. They weren't part of any other organization or anything like that. They raised food and money and clothing for these different families. They also solicited businesses and businessmen to help them to support these families. They published a list of the men who helped them in 1887, which was the second year that the Home Benevolent Society existed. And so we see a lot of familiar last names, Bump and Ralph Conable and Curtis. Hankey is on this list, McComber, Rosenthal, Rowan. So these are all families that we know of and have heard of. Cushman. So these were people that helped either monetarily or with food for the less fortunate families. The society, according to their meeting minutes, had 75 members by the end of their first year, 56 of whom were active, which having been a member of groups, I understand that not all the members are always active, but 56 still sounds like a really good number. They helped 25 families in their first year, providing clothing, money, assistance in job hunting. They had a committee that helped people look for jobs, which I thought was really interesting. And then they also had a Christmas dinner that they provided for all the families that they had helped in that year. Uh-oh, so mine didn't switch. It's supposed to look like something else. Let me see if I can go back. There we go. This is Anna Little Kirkland. She was born in Cartwright, Ontario in 1844. She married Dr. William Little, who you may have heard of because he was one of the first doctors in Petoskey and one of the first people buried at Greenwood Cemetery. They came to Petoskey in 1874, so right when the first trains were coming, and they built a hotel named the Rose House for their friend H.O. Rose, the person who had the lime kiln, among other things. Their hotel later became the Occidental Hotel, which looks like this. Dr. Little was made the postmaster, but he died in 1876, and Anna took over his postmaster duties, which meant that she was also in charge of payroll, and she acted as the bank for 4 years. Then she married Thomas Kirkland in 1880. They lived on East Lake Street and later on Summit Street. Here's their home on the corner of Lake and Williams. She was one of the first presidents of the Women's Federated Clubs, and she was active in the Presbyterian Church and the Church Sunday School. So in addition to the Home Benevolent Society, she also was a member of some other clubs, which is evident with a lot of the women that I've studied. This is Lockwood Hospital, and I have this picture because I couldn't find a picture of Mahala Ramsby, sorry. Mahala Cochran Ramsby was born in Perry County, Ohio in 1848. She married Alan Ramsby in 1866, and they moved to Petoskey in 1877. So just a few years after the trains had come. For a while, they lived about 6 miles west of town at a place called Carpenter's Corners, which I had not heard before. Meryl, I don't know if you've heard of that, Carpenter's Corners. They moved back to Petoskey in 1893. Their daughter was the Mrs. Bowman, who was the chair of this 1974 meeting. And so I imagine that she talked a lot about her mother, but she didn't leave any of the pictures here at the Historical Society for anybody else to see. So I don't have a lot of information about her, unfortunately, because Mert left his notes, but Mrs. Bowman didn't leave hers. I do know, though, that Mrs. Ramsby was also involved in the Methodist Church. She was one of the vice presidents of the Home Benevolent Society. They had several. She was also involved in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Women's Relief Corps, and the Lockwood Hospital Auxiliary. Here's Vina Hankey. Thank you, Meryl, for sending me these pictures. Vina was born in New York in 1845. Oh, or 44, depending on what year you look at my slide. Goodness. She and her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ira Remington, came to Grass Lake, Michigan. And then she married C.F. Hankey in 1864, and they came to Petoskey in 1880. She was the treasurer of the Home Benevolent Society and a member of the Presbyterian Church. She passed away in 1915. And I love this family picture. It's such a good one. So Vina was in charge of the treasury of the Home Benevolent Society, and she was treasurer for as long as the society existed, basically. This is Juliet Rose. Juliet Burbeck Rose. She was born in Racine, Wisconsin in 1838, and she married Hiram Rose in Northport in 1856. And he's the one who had been out to the gold rush and made some money and then came back to Michigan and came to Petoskey and had the lime kilns. They came to Petoskey in 1872. So they were here early before the trains were even coming. They had come by boat from Northport in the Traverse City area. She was a member of Emmanuel Episcopal, and one of the vice presidents of the Home Benevolent Society. And her husband actually operated a store with Chief Petoskey and also ran the lime kiln. So I had mentioned that the Home Benevolent Society wasn't related to any one church, and you can see that we've already got the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist, Emmanuel Episcopal represented. This is Lelia Rowan. I love this picture of Leila. I use this all the time because I think it's such a great picture. She was born in Fairport, Pennsylvania in 1836. Her parents were Reverend and Mrs. Joseph Weaver. Leila taught school in Pennsylvania as a young girl. You can imagine, 15, 16 years old, and they were teaching school. When she was 14, she had a serial story published in the Erie Gazette, which inspired her to write many, many things over her lifetime. She married Joseph Rowan in Aurora, Illinois in 1862, and they moved to Petoskey in 1875. So you can see most of these families, because these are the founding mothers, came right around the same time as the railroad did. For a time, Leila's organ was the only musical instrument in town, and there are reports, I think this must have been a small organ, because there are reports of taking this organ to different activities. And I just can't imagine today me saying, hey, let's take the organ to wherever. So it must have been something small. But hers was the only musical instrument in town. She was the organist for the Presbyterian Church. She taught Sunday school there as well. She and her husband homesteaded for 2 years. They didn't have to homestead the whole 5 years that were generally required because Civil War veterans got to count their war service in their homesteading time. And so he had served for 3 years during the Civil War and got to count that as part of his homesteading time. So after 2 years, they were able to sell that property and move into town. They built a home on Mitchell Street, and then they operated the Clifton Hotel for 36 years. Leila was part of the Home Benevolent Society. She hosted the Mossback Balls at the Clifton Hotel. So part of the support for the Mossback families was that they had this party in the fall at the Clifton Hotel, and they would all come into town. They'd bring their kids. The kids would be put into a couple of hotel rooms, and the parents would dance and have a meal and enjoy some time. It sounded like after the harvest type of thing at the Clifton Hotel, and that was put on by the Home Benevolent Society. Leila wrote a book of poetry called Trailing Arbutus that you can read in Google Books now for free. It's full of poetry about this area. She was a member of lots of different groups, including the Order of the Eastern Star, which is a Masonic group, the Queen Esther Shrine, the Lombard Women's Relief Corps, which was the women's auxiliary for Civil War vets in the area. She was also part of the Lady Maccabees, which I had to look up, and that was an insurance group that some women started for women's insurance, which I thought was really interesting. Here's the Clifton Hotel that she and her husband ran for 36 years. This is her daughter, Ethel Rowan Fesquel. Ethel wrote a book when Michigan was young. She wrote this later in life. She was also a journalist. So she wrote for some Grand Rapids newspapers and the Petoskey Evening News. And she was also part of the women's suffrage organization. And this is Frances Pailthorp's mother, Jessie Westcott Pailthorp. Let's see, she was born in 1861. She died in 1936. and she too was part of the Home Benevolent Society. And this is a picture of her in a dress that her mother made for her to go to Lansing because Judge Pailthorp, like I guess he wasn't a judge at the time, was a state representative. Here's her daughter, Frances. And it is thanks to Frances that we have a lot of the information that we have here at the museum because she did a lot of writing, albeit difficult handwriting to read, but thank you, Frances. She wrote lots of histories of things, and she also collected lots of things. So the quill boxes that we have are thanks to Frances, and some beautiful scrapbooks where she collected designs of quill boxes. So at the 1974 meeting, they shared the scrapbooks, as well as the audience had an opportunity to go look at some of the quill boxes. So I've got some pictures for you. Frances was, I feel like I talk about Frances all the time, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating for you because you probably heard me talk about her, but she attended the University of Michigan, the Chicago Art Institute, Olivet College, and Prang College of Chicago. So she's super well educated. She taught art at Petoskey from 1905 to 1951. She was, so I've got a ways to go before I match Frances. She was a member of the Garden Club. She also sponsored the Junior Garden Club for children. She was especially interested in Odawa art. And she traveled around the country collecting art, and especially Native American art. She also took a trip to Europe to buy art for the high school to display. And the women's club or the federated clubs, I can't remember which, sponsored her trip so she could travel around Europe buying art. And they paid for the art as well. So in 1974, they shared about some of the women and their quill boxes. This is Margaret Boyd, Margaret Blackbird Boyd. She was born in 1817. She was educated in Cincinnati. She was a teacher, and she was an Odawa woman who traveled to Washington, D.C. She wanted to go talk to the president because she was upset that treaties were not being upheld. Many tribal members were upset about this, and Margaret was one who traveled to Washington to do something about it. The story goes that she didn't have money for a train ticket all the way to Washington, and so she stopped along the way and made baskets and sold them so that she could pay for her train ticket for the next train. The design here was drawn by Frances based on some of Margaret's quill boxes. So we have some of Margaret's baskets and quill boxes here at the museum. And I recently learned that one of her quill boxes is at the Chicago Art Institute, and also a small canoe that she decorated in quills is at the Chicago Art Institute. And they had been on display for 40 or 50 years. They'd been on display a long time, but they were recently taken off display. And I was so disappointed to learn just recently that they're there, but no longer on display. I've probably seen them and didn't realize what they were. She also has some quill boxes at the Public Museum in Grand Rapids. This is Angeline Chippewa, and she was from Cross Village. She was married to John Chippewa. Oh, and I thought I had some of her boxes. Sorry, I don't have those. Here's Mary Mixamong. Mary Mixamong was born around 1875. She was married to John Mixamong, who was also an artist. She lived in Cross Village, and one of her quill boxes was sent to the Cranbrook Institute, and Carl Mills, who was the director there at the time, sent her a note back to tell her how much he liked her art and admired her work. But she passed away before she received the note. And Frances wrote in one of the histories that she left here at the museum about how she was so sad that Mary never got to see this note from Carl Mills at the Cranbrook Institute about how wonderful her work was. These are two designs. Again, these were drawn and painted by Frances based on the quill work that was done on the different quill boxes. And these are in really big scrapbooks. If you ever want to see them, I'm happy to pull them out. They're huge. They take up the whole table up here at the museum office. Oh, here's Angeline Chippewa. I had them out of order. So these are some of Angeline Chippewa's designs. This one on the right is one of those little churches or houses that we have on display. And down at the bottom, you can kind of see these tassels. So it's a little purse or bag of some kind. And again, these are all designs that Frances drew looking at the quill boxes. Oh, and then I had some information about Rose Showman, but I didn't have any pictures. She was another one of the artists. So then in the program, they it was an interesting order to the program, but I think because they talked about Frances, then they wanted to show the Odawa artists. So Rachel Rosenthal isn't someone that I know too much about because she wasn't here very long. Excuse me. So Rachel Reinhertz Rosenthal, and I have to investigate her Reinhertz connection a little more. She was born either in Poland or in Russia. And because all the different changes in borders and things, I'm not sure where. She married Samuel Rosenthal and they came to Petoskey in 1877. So came here pretty early. They established Rosenthal's department store. She died in 1889 and she was part of the Home Benevolence Society, and in their meeting minutes, they talk about meeting at her house, which was on Michigan Street, in the spacious parlors of her home, to be exact. This is her daughter-in-law, Minnie Rosenthal, and I love this picture also. I just think it's a beautiful picture. So Minnie's name was Wilhelmine Wunderlich, which I think is a fabulous name, but Wilhelmine is Minnie. And she was born in Fairfield, Maine in 1868. She moved to Chicago with her parents and she married Alec Rosenthal. So then she became Minnie Rosenthal. They moved to Petoskey in 1894. She was president of the Temple Sisterhood, president of the Women's Federated Clubs. She was a member of the Women's Club, the Lockwood Auxiliary, and she was active in the Emmett County Suffrage Association. So this woman did a lot. And this is her sister Zilla, and I always feel bad about this picture. There must be another picture of Zilla somewhere. And Zilla was part of the Women's Suffrage Association. The sisters helped to run Rosenthal's department store. They also traveled around the state doing suffrage work, and they also went to the National Suffrage Conference that was held in Chicago. And I remember reading the meeting minutes, and I don't remember the dates, but it was something like the meeting was on Monday and they were elected to go to the conference on Tuesday. And so off they went, got on the train and went to Chicago. Here's some more about Mrs. Alec Rosenthal, that's Minnie, and Mrs. Goldstein, that's Zilla, who've been attending the state conference or state convention. So they traveled all around doing suffrage work. Here's the Federation of Women's Clubs. The Federation was sort of an umbrella organization for many of the clubs in town. And so they would meet and organize a lot of the clubs were pretty small and couldn't do a lot by themselves, but if you got a whole bunch of clubs together, then you could accomplish something. So when they wanted to do fundraising for big things, or when they wanted to hold big events, they could get all the clubs together. They also, if they were having an event, this way could get a lot more people to come to a concert or an art show or things like that, because they were all part of this federation. Here's Mary Curtis. Mary Wooding was born in New York City on February 17th, 1846. Her family moved to Michigan when she was 12 because her father wanted to become a farmer, which I thought was fascinating. She was sent back to New York City for her education. She met and married William Curtis in the Kalamazoo area, and they came to Petoskey. They were among the people who came on that first train when they brought dignitaries from Grand Rapids to show that the train tracks had come this far. And the Curtises were on that train, and that was what introduced them to Petoskey. And then they later moved to Petoskey. She was involved in the Presbyterian Church. She was on the library board, the Curtis Park Club, which is an obvious one, the DAR. She was on several committees for the Women's Federated Clubs. And it is Mary Curtis that we have to thank for both the clock on the courthouse and the fountain at Mineral Well Park, which is no longer a fountain, and I think it should be again. So that may be a cause that we could take up at some point, because I think a fountain over there would be beautiful, and not just a little bit of shrubbery. So Mary Curtis was involved in a lot of things, and really willing to support a lot of different causes. This is Marguerite Roosh. She was part of the Red Cross, as you can see in the picture. And this is a Roosh jeweler family member, and she was part of women's suffrage. She was also part of the women's clubs and the women's federated clubs, and part of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And I think this is a great picture too. Here's a women's club program. So we have a lot of these different programs. And I wanted to show this because it shows the meeting minutes. So those are really fun to read. And some of the meeting minutes from these different clubs I've transcribed, and they're available on our website. Some of them I've just taken pictures of, but they're really interesting to read how active these women were in civic matters, in education matters, and all the different things that they were doing. And some of them have amazing club meeting minutes where they tell about what cookies they were serving and how the table was decorated and what songs they sang or listened to and who recited what poem and all kinds of things. So they're really interesting, detailed meeting minutes. And a lot of those are available on our website. The Assembly Study Club. So women were really interested in educating themselves. Assembly Study Club was one that took that very seriously. This article happens to be about women's suffrage, but they did a lot of different things to educate themselves, and they had different topics that they would discuss. This one, they were going to have a debate. So they were really involved, not just in, they weren't just going to parties and having tea and things like that, which is great, but they were involved in many other aspects of city life as well, even though they couldn't vote. This is Alice Irwin. Alice is one of my favorite authors. She was a naturalist. She wrote a newspaper column about the natural things that really that she was seeing outside her window. She lived in Harbor Springs. She was involved in women's suffrage. She was involved in the women's club, and her husband took all her newspaper columns and made them into sort of a day by day book of what was happening around in the area. So it's really fun to read because, you know, in the winter, she talks about the rabbits and the deer that are outside the window, and in the spring, what flowers are coming up. And so, you know, it's here, but she's writing over 100 years ago, and it sounds still so familiar. Here's Margaret Hankey Curtis, another beautiful picture. So at the end of the program in 1974, they asked people if they would like to talk about any of women in their families, and somebody spoke about Margaret. Meryl, do you want to talk about Margaret? Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Here's some more equal suffrage pictures. Oh, I wanted to show that they held conferences here. They were involved in supporting orphans in France. I mean, they were doing lots and lots and lots of things. The Women's Foreign Missionary Society. This is another early one from 1898. You can see some of the women involved in that. Mrs. Bump was one of those, Mrs. Ingalls, Mrs. Merrill. And on this one, they give their first names, which is nice. Here's Mahala Ramsby, second vice president of the Women's Foreign Mission Society. She was one I talked about earlier from the Home Benevolent Association. So these are all the federated clubs. So these women were involved in a lot. All of these different clubs were in Petoskey in the 1870s and 80s and later into the teens. I just think it's an incredible list. There were other clubs that weren't part of the federated clubs, like the Do Your Bit Club, the Monday Club. They met on Mondays. Great name. The DAR. And then these are the club committees. So I wanted to show that they were really involved in all parts of city life. They had a sanitation committee, a home improvement committee. So they were helping people or recommending that people do some home improvement. They had a forestry committee, also things like moving pictures. So involved in their children's lives, improving education, but also improving their own lives. Equal suffrage, the community restroom, roads and alleys. They had an anti-cigarette committee. They had a juvenile court committee. So lots of different things that they were involved in. So if you were here, I would invite you to visit the quill boxes. I would invite you to share about any founding mothers or women in your family. If you would like to now, you certainly can. Coming up on December 4th, I will be presenting about King Strang, which is a program I did earlier this year, but this time it will be for the Michigan Historical Society, their History Hounds program, and that's December 4th. December 12th, I'm doing a program on Christmas shopping, and that is a 1974 throwback program. So that I'm going to be looking at different stores that were around in the, I don't know, 1880s, 90s, teens, some of the ads they put in the paper for Christmas shopping, what some of the prices were for different items, what some of the interesting items were that they were advertising for Christmas shopping. And then we're hosting our Christmas open house on December 13th, and that's from 6 to 8 p.m. and we'll be serving refreshments, and Santa will be here. And so I hope that you can come down and see us at the Christmas open house as well. So I will stop sharing. And I'm going to see if I can stop recording.